On the 15th day of April in the year 1452, in a stone farmhouse perched among the Tuscan hills, a child entered the world under circumstances that would shape not only his destiny, but the course of human achievement itself. The place was Anchiano, a hamlet so small it barely warranted a name, situated near the town of Vinci, itself a modest collection of buildings clinging to the slopes of Monte Albano. The child was born to Caterina, a young peasant woman whose name history would barely preserve, and Ser Piero da Vinci, a notary from a family of notaries, a man whose ambitions extended well beyond the countryside and the complications of a liaison with a woman of no social standing. The birth was recorded by the child's grandfather, Antonio da Vinci, with a precision that suggests both pride and perhaps a hint of defiance. "A grandson of mine was born," he wrote in his ledger, "son of Ser Piero, my son." The careful notation of the hour, the witnesses present, the day itself speaks to the old man's desire to anchor this life in the solid ground of documentation, even as the circumstances of conception remained unspoken, understood, and legally significant. For this child, named Leonardo, would bear throughout his life the designation that defined him before he could walk or speak: illegitimate, a bastard. Born outside the sanctioned bonds of marriage, outside the inheritance laws that governed property and profession, outside the guilds that regulated craft and commerce. Yet Italy, in the middle of the 15th century, was a land in the throes of transformation, a peninsula of city-states where old certainties were crumbling like ancient Roman walls, and new possibilities emerged from the rubble. To the south and west, Florence was awakening from centuries of medieval slumber into something unprecedented, something that would later be called, with no small degree of self-congratulation, the Renaissance. The Medici family, bankers who had transformed commercial success into political dominance, were consolidating their grip on the Republic. Cosimo de' Medici, the elder statesman, had learned that art and architecture could purchase immortality more surely than gold, and the city was beginning to fill with marble and bronze testaments to human ambition. In the workshops of Florence, in the studios where master craftsmen trained apprentices in techniques passed down through generations, a new spirit was stirring. Artists were no longer content to be anonymous artisans, their names forgotten as soon as the paint dried or the stone was set. They studied mathematics and optics, anatomy and perspective. They signed their works. They competed for commissions with a fierceness that sometimes erupted into actual violence. The artist was becoming something more than a skilled laborer. He was becoming, slowly and against considerable resistance, an intellectual, a philosopher of the visible world. Into this moment of historical pivot, Leonardo arrived bearing what might have seemed like an insurmountable disadvantage. As an illegitimate child, he could not inherit his father's profession. The Notary Guild, like most professional associations of the time, barred bastards from membership. He could not follow Ser Piero into the comfortable world of legal documents and property transfers, of merchant contracts and municipal appointments. The door to respectable, predictable prosperity was closed to him before he could reach the handle. His father would marry, legitimately, 4 times, producing 12 legitimate children who would inherit what Leonardo could not. But history, in its inscrutable wisdom, had gifted him something more valuable than a notary's practice: freedom. The freedom from expectation, from prescribed paths, from the limiting definitions of guild and inheritance law. Because he could not be a notary, he would not be bound by the intellectual constraints of legal training. Because he could not inherit land or position, he would have to create his own worth, forge his own identity from raw talent and relentless observation. The stigma of illegitimacy, which might have crushed a lesser spirit, became for Leonardo a kind of liberation, a severance from the conventional that allowed him to approach the world with fresh eyes, unencumbered by the assumption that things must be as they had always been. The Tuscan hills where he drew his first breath would remain with him always, their contours embedded in his vision, their light and shadow teaching him lessons he would spend a lifetime exploring. In the accident of his birth lay the seeds of his genius. In the exclusion he faced the origins of his relentless independence. History had marked him as an outsider, and he would spend his life seeing what those inside the walls could not perceive, asking questions that those with inheritances and guild memberships would never think to ask. The boy grew up where earth and sky conducted their eternal conversation, where terraced hillsides climbed toward clouds and ancient olive trees twisted their silver-green leaves toward the sun. Anchiano and Vinci were not cities, but pauses in the landscape, collections of stone buildings that seemed to emerge from the very rock of the mountains, as if human habitation was simply another form that Tuscan geology could take. This was a world of small sounds and vast silences, of shepherd bells echoing across valleys, of water running over stone in countless small streams that carved their patient way toward the Arno River below. Leonardo spent his early years in the household of his grandfather Antonio and his uncle Francesco, Ser Piero's younger brother, who, unlike his ambitious sibling, seemed content with the rhythms of rural life. Here, in this environment of limited human conversation but infinite natural dialogue, the child's extraordinary capacity for observation began to manifest itself. While other children learned their letters and their catechism, Leonardo learned to read the book of nature, a text infinitely more complex and rewarding than anything written on vellum or paper. He watched birds with an intensity that bordered on obsession, noting how they tilted their wings to catch the wind, how they adjusted tail feathers to steer, how they hung motionless in the air as if suspended by invisible threads. He would later write that his earliest memory was of a bird of prey descending to his cradle, opening his mouth with its tail and striking him repeatedly between the lips. Whether this was genuine memory or a dream retroactively positioned as origin myth matters less than what it reveals. That from his first consciousness, Leonardo understood himself as somehow marked by flight, by the ambition to transcend the earthbound limitations of human existence. Water fascinated him equally, its behavior seemingly simple yet endlessly varied. He observed how streams created eddies around rocks, how water poured from one level to another formed particular patterns in the air, how puddles reflected sky but distorted the reflection in ways that followed mathematical principles he could sense but not yet articulate. He noted how rain fell, how dew formed on leaves in the morning, how frost created geometric patterns on stones. The liquid element, which covered most of the earth and composed most of the human body, became for him a subject of lifelong investigation. Light, too, captured his attention in ways that marked him as different from his playmates. He noticed how shadows were not simply dark, but contained their own subtle illuminations, how the setting sun transformed the colors of the hillsides, how mist and atmosphere altered the appearance of distant mountains, making them appear blue-gray rather than their actual earth tones. He observed that objects nearby appeared sharply defined, while those far away seemed to dissolve into softer forms, their edges less distinct. These observations, made by a child with no formal training in optics or artistic technique, would later revolutionize the way painters represented three-dimensional space on two-dimensional surfaces. His education, such as it was, came not from schools but from experience. He learned to read and write Italian, though he would never master Latin, the language of scholars and the educated elite, a deficiency that would later make him defensive about his lack of classical learning. He absorbed the practical knowledge of country people, how to predict weather, how to judge the quality of soil, which plants were edible and which poisonous, how to find one's way through forests without marked paths. This was an education in observation and inference rather than authority and memorization, a training that taught him to trust what he could see and test rather than what books claimed to be true. Uncle Francesco became perhaps his most important early influence. A man who loved the countryside and had no desire to leave it for the competitive world of Florentine commerce and politics, Francesco would walk with his nephew through the hills, neither of them speaking much, both simply present to the world around them. In these silent walks, Leonardo learned that observation was itself a form of knowledge, that simply paying attention with full presence could reveal truths that hurried minds would miss. The isolation of these years, the distance from urban culture and formal education, gave Leonardo something that children raised in cities rarely acquire: uninterrupted time to develop his own ways of thinking, free from the constant correction and direction of teachers and tutors. His mind grew wild like the mountain plants, following its own patterns of development, spreading roots in directions that no cultivated garden would permit. The countryside taught him that nature operated according to principles that could be discovered through careful watching, that the world made sense if one simply paid close enough attention. These years of freedom, of wandering the Tuscan landscape with eyes wide open and mind unconstrained by conventional learning, established the foundation for everything that would follow. The mountains and olive groves, the birds and streams, the play of light on ancient stone, all of it was forming in the child a way of seeing that would eventually astonish the world. When Leonardo arrived in Florence around 1466 at approximately 14 years of age, he entered a world that must have seemed to him like a different species of reality entirely. Where Vinci had been all horizontal expanses and distant horizons, Florence was vertical, dense, chaotic, magnificent. The city pressed itself against the traveler from all sides, buildings rising 3 and 4 stories high, streets so narrow that neighbors could lean from opposing windows and shake hands. The constant noise of commerce and craft echoing from workshop doorways, the smell of leather and dye and paint and human bodies packed into tight quarters. The dome of the cathedral, Brunelleschi's impossible achievement completed just 2 decades earlier, dominated the skyline like a demonstration in stone and brick of what human ambition could accomplish when it refused to acknowledge limitations. The engineering marvel had required the invention of new techniques, new tools, new ways of thinking about weight and stress and structural integrity. It stood as both building and manifesto, proclaiming that the ancient Romans were not the unsurpassable masters that medieval Europe had believed them to be, that modernity could match and even exceed the accomplishments of antiquity. Ser Piero had arranged for his illegitimate son to enter the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most respected artists in Florence, a master whose bottega on Via dell'Agnolo functioned as both business establishment and educational institution. Verrocchio, whose name meant true eye, ran an operation that produced not just paintings but sculptures in bronze and marble, architectural designs, theatrical sets, goldsmith work, and ecclesiastical furnishings. To enter his workshop was to enter a complete world of making, where the boundaries between art and craft, between beauty and utility, between imagination and technical execution were constantly negotiated and redefined. The workshop operated according to a system refined over centuries. Young apprentices, usually boys from artisan families, began with the most menial tasks: grinding pigments, cleaning brushes, preparing wooden panels, mixing plaster. They learned by watching and by doing, gradually being entrusted with more complex responsibilities as they demonstrated competence. A talented apprentice might progress to drawing, then to painting background elements in a master's composition, eventually to executing entire works from the master's designs. The system produced skilled craftsmen but rarely produced innovators. Innovation was not particularly valued in a world where consistent quality and timely delivery mattered more than originality. Into this structured environment came Leonardo, older than most new apprentices, bearing none of the preliminary training that boys raised in artisan households would have absorbed from infancy. But he brought something else, those years of observing nature with unmediated intensity, that capacity to see relationships and patterns, that hunger to understand how things worked. Verrocchio recognized something in the young man that transcended technical skill, though Leonardo would quickly develop that as well. The master saw a mind that asked fundamental questions, that was not satisfied with knowing how to mix a particular shade of blue, but needed to understand why that combination of substances produced that particular color. The workshop became Leonardo's university, its daily practices his curriculum. He learned to draw from plaster casts of classical sculptures, training his hand to translate three-dimensional forms onto two-dimensional surfaces. He studied perspective, the mathematical system that allowed painters to create the illusion of depth, learning the geometric principles that governed how parallel lines converged at vanishing points, how objects diminished in size as they receded into pictorial space. He practiced anatomy, drawing from live models, beginning to understand the structure of muscles and bones beneath the skin, the mechanics of how bodies moved and gestured. But Florence offered education beyond the workshop walls. The city was thick with genius in the 1460s and 70s. The Medici court patronized philosophers who lectured on Plato and the ancient Greek mysteries. Sculptors competed for commissions with a ferocity that occasionally resulted in actual lawsuits. The mathematician Paolo Toscanelli maintained astronomical observations and corresponded with thinkers across Europe. The very air seemed charged with possibility, with the sense that human beings were capable of more than they had previously imagined, that the darkness of the medieval centuries was lifting to reveal a world that could be understood, measured, represented, and ultimately mastered. Leonardo absorbed it all with his characteristic intensity, his mind making connections that others missed, seeing implications that others overlooked. He was no longer the country boy wandering olive groves, but not yet the master he would become. These were years of formation, of skills acquired and sensibilities refined, of a talent so large it barely fit within the conventional structures meant to contain and direct it. In Verrocchio's workshop, surrounded by the concentrated genius of Renaissance Florence, with Brunelleschi's impossible dome rising above the red tile roofs, Leonardo began the transformation from observer to creator, from student of nature to its interpreter and rival. The apprentice was awakening, and the world, though it did not yet know it, would never be quite the same. The education of an artist in 15th century Florence was an education in seeing, but more than that, it was an education in the hand's ability to translate what the eye perceived into marks on paper, pigment on panel, form in bronze or stone. Verrocchio's workshop operated like a small factory of beauty, with each craftsman specializing in particular techniques while contributing to collective projects. The master himself moved between commissions with the efficiency of a successful merchant, for that is what he essentially was, a merchant of images and objects, selling his workshop's products to churches, guilds, and wealthy families who wanted to display their piety or prestige through commissioned art. Leonardo learned the chemistry of color first, grinding minerals and earth into powder, mixing them with binding agents to create paint that would adhere to surfaces and resist the ravages of time. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan became ultramarine blue, the most expensive pigment, reserved for the Virgin Mary's robes in religious paintings. Lead, white and bone black, vermilion from crushed cinnabar, earth reds and ochres from Italian soil. Each color had its own preparation method, its own characteristics, its own expense. To understand painting was first to understand materials, to know intimately the physical substances that created visual effects. Perspective, that mathematical key that unlocked pictorial space, required rigorous study. Brunelleschi had codified the system decades earlier, demonstrating that a painting could function as a window through which the viewer gazed into a geometrically coherent space. Leonardo learned to construct his compositions using perspective lines, to calculate the diminishment of objects as they receded, to create the illusion that painted surfaces extended back into depth rather than remaining stubbornly flat. But he would eventually go beyond the rigid perspective of his teachers, understanding that atmospheric conditions also affected how distant objects appeared. That air itself had substance and altered what passed through it. Anatomy became another obsession, though in these early years his study remained superficial, limited to external observation of how muscles created form beneath skin, how joints articulated, how weight distributed itself through standing or moving bodies. The deeper investigations, the dissections that would come later, were still years away. For now he drew living models in countless poses, training his hand to capture gesture and proportion, the subtle shifts of weight that made a figure seem alive rather than rigid. The moment that would become legend occurred sometime around 1472 or 1473, when Verrocchio was completing a large altarpiece for the monastery of San Salvi, the baptism of Christ. The master had composed the scene in his characteristic style, solid, competent, somewhat stiff in the formal manner of the time. Christ stood in the Jordan River while John the Baptist poured water over his head. Angels attended at the left. The Holy Spirit descended from above in the form of a dove. Verrocchio assigned the young Leonardo to paint one of the angels, a relatively minor element in the overall composition. What Leonardo produced astonished everyone who saw it. Where Verrocchio's figures possessed a sculptural solidity, Leonardo's angels seemed to exist in actual atmosphere, light playing across its features with a softness that made it appear three-dimensional in a way that transcended mere perspective. The face turned at an angle that suggested interior consciousness, not just external pose. The hair fell in natural curls rather than stylized patterns. The hands held their drapery with a grace that suggested actual weight and texture. Next to Verrocchio's workmanlike competence, Leonardo's contribution glowed with a vitality that exposed the limitations of traditional technique. The story, perhaps embellished but fundamentally true, held that Verrocchio, upon seeing what his apprentice had painted, put down his brushes and never painted again, recognizing that he had been surpassed. Whether the master actually abandoned painting entirely is debatable. He continued to operate his workshop for years afterward, but the symbolic truth of the tale resonated because it captured something essential. That talent of a fundamentally different order had announced itself, that the apprentice possessed not just skill, but vision. The workshop in those years contained other talents who would leave their marks on Renaissance art. Sandro Botticelli, several years older than Leonardo, worked alongside him on various projects before establishing his own practice and creating his flowing, lyrical paintings of mythological subjects. Pietro Perugino, who would later teach Raphael, brought to the workshop a gentleness of expression that contrasted with Verrocchio's more robust style. Lorenzo di Credi, closer to Leonardo in age, became both colleague and friend, one of the few people with whom Leonardo maintained sustained contact over decades. These young men formed a brotherhood of sorts, united by their training and their ambitions, though also divided by rivalry and the competitive nature of Florentine art world. They shared technical knowledge, argued about methods, competed for attention and commissions. In this crucible of talent and ambition, Leonardo refined not just his skills but his sense of what art could accomplish, what seeing really meant. He was learning to see beneath surfaces, to perceive the principles that governed appearance, to understand that mastery required not just reproducing what the eye perceived, but grasping why things looked the way they did. The hand could only paint what the mind understood, and Leonardo's mind was beginning to understand things that others had not yet thought to question. By his early 20s, Leonardo had progressed from apprentice to independent master, authorized by the guild to accept commissions under his own name. The transition marked his formal entry into the competitive marketplace of Florentine art, where reputation meant everything, and a single failed commission could damage a career beyond repair. The city's wealthy families, its religious institutions, its civic organizations, all required a constant supply of paintings, sculptures, and decorative arts to mark births and deaths, weddings and funerals, to beautify chapels and adorn palaces, to demonstrate taste and affirm status. His early independent works showed both the promise of genius and the seeds of what would become his most defining characteristic, an inability or unwillingness to declare a work finished. Around 1474, Bernardo Bembo, the Venetian ambassador to Florence, commissioned a portrait of his young lover Ginevra de' Benci, a poetess from a wealthy Florentine family. What Leonardo produced departed from the conventional profile portraits that dominated Italian art at the time. He positioned Ginevra at a three-quarter angle, her face emerging from shadow with a psychological complexity that transcended mere physical likeness. The background, instead of the usual flat gold or decorative patterns, depicted an actual landscape, though viewed through what seemed like twilight or dawn, a dim atmosphere that made the trees and water behind her appear almost dreamlike. Her expression was difficult to read, not smiling, not frowning, but existing in some interior space of contemplation. The painting's reverse side bore a sprig of juniper, a play on her name. Ginepro is Italian for juniper, surrounded by a laurel wreath and palm frond, symbols of her poetic achievement and virtue. Even in this early work, Leonardo demonstrated his refusal to simply fulfill commission requirements. He was already transforming portrait painting into something deeper, more psychologically penetrating. But it was with the adoration of the Magi, commissioned in 1481 by the Augustinian monks of San Donato a Scopeto, that Leonardo's pattern of non-completion first manifested in its full, problematic glory. The commission should have been straightforward: paint an altarpiece depicting the three kings visiting the infant Christ, a common subject with established iconographic traditions. Leonardo accepted the commission, agreed to complete it within 30 months, and began work with characteristic intensity. What emerged on the large wooden panel was revolutionary and chaotic in equal measure. Rather than the orderly, symmetrical compositions typical of the subject, Leonardo created a swirling vortex of humanity surrounding the Madonna and Child. Dozens of figures pressed forward in a semicircle, their faces expressing wonder, reverence, confusion, skepticism, the full range of human responses to the miraculous. Behind them, classical ruins suggested the dying pagan world giving way to Christian revelation. In the background, horses reared and men fought, perhaps representing the turmoil that Christ's arrival would precipitate. The composition pulsed with energy, with psychological complexity, with ambition. Leonardo worked on the underdrawing with obsessive attention, creating a masterpiece of ink and wash that revealed his thinking process. He studied perspective with mathematical rigor, constructed architectural elements with precise vanishing points, arranged figures with sophisticated understanding of spatial recession. He began the underpainting, establishing the tonal structure of the composition. And then, as the deadline approached and passed, as the monks grew increasingly impatient, Leonardo's work slowed, stopped, remained perpetually on the verge of completion, but never actually arriving there. The reasons multiplied like excuses. He needed to study more to understand better the emotions he was trying to represent, to refine his technique, to solve compositional problems that others might not even notice. The monastery eventually lost patience and commissioned another artist, Filippino Lippi, to create a different adoration. Leonardo's panel remained in his studio unfinished, a monument to both genius and paralysis, ambition and inability. The pattern was establishing itself with a clarity that would define his entire career. Leonardo could not finish works because finishing required declaring them complete, accepting their imperfections, admitting that his vision exceeded his ability to execute it. Each painting became not an end in itself, but a means of investigation, a laboratory for exploring problems of representation, psychology, technique. To finish a painting was to stop learning from it, to move on before extracting every possible insight, to accept limitation. His contemporaries struggled to understand this. In a world where artists were paid for completed works, where patrons expected delivery on agreed schedules, where reputation depended on reliability as much as talent, Leonardo's inability to finish seemed like professional incompetence, or worse, artistic temperament carried to self-destructive extremes. But Leonardo was not interested in being a successful workshop master turning out paintings on schedule. To understand Leonardo only as a painter is to misunderstand him entirely, for painting, despite his revolutionary contributions to the art, was never more than one way of investigating the world, one method among many for grasping how reality functioned. Even in these early years in Florence, while he was nominally training and working as an artist, his mind ranged across territories that had nothing to do with pigment or composition, pursuing questions that seemed to have no practical application, but which obsessed him nonetheless. Music fascinated him perhaps as much as visual art, and in this he was not unusual for his time. The Renaissance cultivated the ideal of the universal man, skilled in multiple disciplines, equally comfortable discussing philosophy and designing fortifications, playing the lyre and calculating mathematical ratios. But Leonardo approached music not as a gentleman's accomplishment, but as another phenomenon requiring systematic investigation. He studied the mathematics of harmony, the relationships between string lengths and pitch, the way sound propagated through air and water. He designed instruments of his own invention, including various modifications to the lyre, seeking to improve both the quality and volume of sound they produced. His skill as a musician and his talent for improvisation became known in Florence's cultural circles. He could perform at social gatherings, entertaining wealthy patrons with both technical skill and creative imagination. The lyre he designed, skull-shaped and made of silver, was said to produce sounds of unusual sweetness and power. Music for Leonardo was not separate from his other interests, but connected to them through mathematics and the physics of vibration, through pattern and proportion. A perfectly harmonious chord and a perfectly proportioned painting both expressed the same underlying mathematical relationships that governed the cosmos itself. Engineering drew him with even greater force. Florence in the 1470s was a city of technological innovation, where hydraulic systems controlled water flow, where construction techniques were advancing, where military architecture was adapting to the new realities of gunpowder artillery. Leonardo haunted the workshops of engineers and mechanics, observing how they solved practical problems, how they translated abstract principles into working machines. He was entirely self-taught in this domain, learning through observation and experiment rather than formal instruction, but his artist's eye gave him advantages that traditionally trained engineers lacked. He could visualize mechanical systems three-dimensionally, could see how forces would distribute themselves through structures, could imagine improvements that others missed. His notebooks began appearing during these years, though the earliest ones have been lost. What survives from slightly later periods suggests what these initial volumes must have contained: drawings of machines, sketches of natural phenomena, anatomical studies, mathematical calculations, observations about light and shadow, designs for inventions both practical and fantastical. He wrote in mirror script right to left so that his writing could only be easily read when held up to a mirror. Various theories have attempted to explain this peculiarity, that he was left-handed and found it more natural, that he wanted to keep his observations secret, that it was simply a quirk of his mind, but perhaps it represented something deeper. Leonardo's fundamental difference from others, his tendency to approach everything from unconventional angles. The notebooks were not organized in any systematic way. A page might contain a drawing of a human skull next to a design for a flying machine, a calculation about water flow beside a sketch of a horse, a reminder to buy eggs adjacent to a profound observation about the nature of sight. They functioned as a kind of external memory, a place where he could deposit everything that interested him, which turned out to be nearly everything. The habit of constant documentation, of translating observation into drawing and text, became as natural to him as breathing. He could not simply experience something. He had to capture it, analyze it, understand its underlying principles. This multiplicity of interests, this refusal to confine himself to a single discipline, would later be criticized as lack of focus, as a fatal dilettantism that prevented him from achieving mastery in any single domain. But Leonardo was operating according to a different logic entirely. For him, painting and engineering, music and anatomy, mathematics and architecture were not separate subjects but different aspects of a unified reality. To understand how birds flew was to understand how to paint wind in hair. To study the flow of water was to learn how to depict cloth falling in folds. To dissect a human hand was to comprehend both how to paint it and how to design machines that mimicked its grasping capability. The notebooks reveal a mind that could not stop asking questions. How do birds turn in flight? Why does the moon appear larger at the horizon? What creates the blue of the sky? How does the eye perceive depth? What determines the shape of water droplets? Each question led to others, branching endlessly, creating a vast web of investigation that seemed to have no center and no boundaries. This was not the systematic inquiry of a scholar working through a defined problem, but the omnidirectional curiosity of a mind that found everything worthy of wonder. In 1482, at 30 years of age, Leonardo made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life and work. He would leave Florence, the city of his formation, the republic of artists and merchants, the cradle of the Renaissance itself, and journey north to Milan, a city whose culture and character differed from Florence as iron differs from gold. The decision was partly voluntary, partly strategic, partly an escape from complications that had accumulated in Florence like debts unpaid and promises unkept. The unfinished adoration still sat in his studio, a reproach. Other commissions languished in various states of incompletion. His reputation as an unreliable genius was solidifying in ways that threatened future employment. Milan offered possibilities that Florence could not. Where Florence was a republic, perpetually unstable and politically fractious, Milan was a duchy, under the firm control of the Sforza family, headed by Ludovico Sforza, called Il Moro, the Moor, for his dark complexion. Ludovico ruled as regent for his young nephew, the legitimate duke, though everyone understood that real power resided in his hands, and most suspected he would eventually claim the ducal title officially. He was a man of ambition and culture, determined to make Milan rival Florence and Venice in artistic and intellectual achievement, willing to spend lavishly to attract talent that would glorify his reign. Leonardo composed a letter that has become one of the most remarkable documents in the history of self-promotion, a masterpiece of strategic positioning disguised as humble service offering. The letter barely mentioned painting. Instead, Leonardo presented himself primarily as a military engineer, listing in meticulous detail the various instruments of war he could design and build. Portable bridges light enough to carry yet strong enough to support armies, methods for destroying enemy, fortifications, designs for covered vehicles that could penetrate enemy lines while protecting those inside, catapults and trebuchets of new design, ships that could resist cannon fire, secret passages and tunnels for sieges. Only in the letter's final paragraph did he mention his artistic abilities, almost as an afterthought. In painting, I can do as well as anyone else. Moreover, I could undertake work on the bronze horse, which will endow with immortal glory and eternal honor the auspicious memory of your father and the illustrious house of Sforza. The casual confidence of as well as anyone else regarding painting, when he had already demonstrated abilities that surpassed his contemporaries, reveals Leonardo's shrewd understanding of his audience. Ludovico needed military engineers. Milan was surrounded by hostile powers, its security dependent on walls and weapons. Artists were plentiful, but skilled military architects were rare and valuable. Whether Ludovico actually read this letter remains uncertain. Leonardo may have presented himself through intermediaries, through connections established via Lorenzo de' Medici, who maintained diplomatic relations with Milan, and may have seen an opportunity to export a talented but troublesome figure to a rival court. However the introduction occurred, Leonardo arrived in Milan carrying with him the silver lyre he had designed, presenting it as a gift from Lorenzo to Ludovico, along with his own skills as a musician and engineer. The journey from Florence to Milan was not simply a change of geography, but a transformation of identity. In Florence, Leonardo had been one talented artist among many, distinguished by his abilities, but hindered by his inability to deliver completed works on schedule. In Milan, he could reinvent himself as a universal man, an engineer who also painted, a designer of marvels who happened to create beautiful images. The change of context allowed him to escape the limiting categories that Florence had imposed, to become something larger and more multifaceted than painter. Milan itself was different in character from Florence, where Florence prized republican virtues and commercial success. Milan was a military state, its culture shaped by its position as a strategic prize in the perpetual conflicts between France, the Holy Roman Empire, Venice, and the papacy. The city's wealth came not from banking or textile manufacturing, but from armaments and agriculture, from the rich plains of Lombardy that fed armies and cities across northern Italy. The Visconti family, who had ruled before the Sforzas, had built a magnificent cathedral that still dominated the city centre, its Gothic spires rising above red-tiled roofs, a testament to ambitions that spanned generations. Ludovico's court was cultivating magnificence. He patronized poets and philosophers, maintained a library, commissioned buildings and artworks meant to demonstrate that Milan could match any Italian city in cultural achievement. He was building the Certosa di Pavia, an extraordinary monastery whose church would rival any in Europe. He was planning improvements to the city's canal system, reconsidering its defensive fortifications, dreaming of urban transformations that would require exactly the kind of polymathic intelligence that Leonardo possessed. Into this environment of ambition and power, Leonardo inserted himself, carrying his letter of impossible promises, his silver lyre, his notebooks full of designs and observations. He was offering himself as a solution to problems Ludovico faced, as an instrument of the Duke's will, as a mind capable of translating imagination into reality. The apprentice who had arrived in Florence years earlier as an illegitimate boy from the countryside was gone, replaced by a confident master ready to serve power, while pursuing his own insatiable curiosity. Milan would give him nearly 18 years, the longest sustained period he would spend anywhere. Years of productivity and frustration, triumph and failure, discovery and dead ends. But in 1482, arriving in the city with his letter of promises, he carried only ambition and talent, confidence and hope, the certainty that he could deliver marvels if given the opportunity. The court of Ludovico Sforza became Leonardo's laboratory, his stage, his university, and his prison, all at once. Here, freed from guild restrictions and the competitive chaos of Republican Florence, he could explore the full range of his interests, could be simultaneously artist and engineer, theorist and practical mechanic, entertainer and intellectual. Ludovico valued versatility, needed men who could solve diverse problems, who could design a fortress in the morning and organize a theatrical pageant in the evening. Leonardo had found, perhaps for the first time in his life, a context that matched the scope of his abilities. His duties at court were marvelously varied. He designed stage sets for theatrical productions, creating mechanical marvels that transformed static stages into spaces of wonder. Mountains opened to reveal paradise within. Clouds descended bearing gods and heroes. The heavens themselves seemed to rotate, displaying the movements of planets and stars with mechanical precision. These were not mere decorations, but demonstrations of his understanding of optics, mechanics, and dramatic effect. The court's entertainments became showcases for his ingenuity, his ability to unite art and engineering in service of spectacle. Military engineering occupied significant portions of his time. He inspected fortifications throughout Lombardy, recommending improvements, designing new defensive systems adapted to the realities of artillery warfare. Cannon had transformed military architecture. Medieval walls that had withstood siege for centuries could be reduced to rubble in hours by heavy guns. Leonardo studied the problem systematically, calculating trajectories, analyzing the physics of impact, designing fortifications with angled walls that would deflect cannonballs rather than absorbing their full force. His notebooks filled with sketches of bastions and moats, calculations about optimal wall thickness, designs for weapons that might give Milan advantages over its enemies. The court attracted intellectuals from across Italy and beyond. Leonardo encountered mathematicians who introduced him to Euclidean geometry, to problems of proportion and calculation that had occupied ancient Greeks. He met Fra Luca Pacioli, a Franciscan friar and mathematician whose work on divine proportion would profoundly influence Leonardo's thinking about the relationship between mathematics and beauty. Their friendship became one of the most important of Leonardo's life, a meeting of minds that explored the borderlands between number and form, between abstract principle and visible reality. It was at Milan that Leonardo's anatomical investigations intensified beyond surface observation. He began acquiring corpses. How he obtained them remained somewhat mysterious, though hospitals and monasteries sometimes provided bodies of the unclaimed dead for medical study and conducting systematic dissections. This was dangerous work, both physically and legally. The Church did not explicitly forbid anatomical study, but neither did it encourage it. Popular superstition surrounded the practice with horror. To cut into human bodies, to separate muscles from bone, to trace the paths of nerves and blood, vessels to examine internal organs in various states of disease and health required overcoming profound cultural prohibitions. But Leonardo's curiosity was stronger than his revulsion or fear. He approached the human body as he approached everything, as a problem to be solved, a system to be understood, a mechanism whose operations could be revealed through careful observation. He drew what he saw with unprecedented precision, creating anatomical illustrations that would not be surpassed for centuries. He discovered heart valves, understood something of how blood circulated, mapped the nervous system, illustrated the fetus in the womb with accuracy that astonished later medical professionals. His notebooks from this period contain images of such clinical precision and artistic beauty that they seem almost to belong to different enterprises, yet for Leonardo they were the same thing. Understanding required seeing, and seeing required drawing. His social circle expanded to include other artists working in Milan. Ambrogio de Predis, a local painter, became a collaborator. Marco Doggiano and Giovanni Antonio Boltraffio entered his workshop as students, absorbing his techniques and spreading his influence. He maintained a household, employed assistants, operated essentially as Verrocchio had operated in Florence, as master of a bottega that produced art and accepted commissions. But Leonardo's workshop was always somewhat chaotic, never quite achieving the reliable productivity that characterized more conventional operations. He lived well during these years, received regular payments from Ludovico, enjoyed the prestige of court association. He dressed elegantly, cultivated the appearance of a gentleman rather than a craftsman, wore his hair and beard long in a style that struck contemporaries as distinctive, almost prophetic. He was handsome, physically strong, reportedly capable of bending horseshoes with his hands, a vegetarian at a time when meat-eating was universal among those who could afford it, a man whose personal habits marked him as different in subtle ways from his peers. Yet beneath the success, familiar patterns persisted. Commissions progressed slowly or not at all. His perfectionism, his tendency to continually revise and reconsider, his insistence on understanding every technical problem completely before proceeding meant that finished works emerged from his studio at a pace that frustrated patrons and damaged his reputation as a reliable craftsman. He was becoming legendary for his genius and equally legendary for his inability to complete what he started. The court tolerated this because Ludovico valued him for more than painting, because his engineering advice and theatrical spectacles and intellectual presence justified his salary even when easel paintings remained incomplete. Milan was giving him something Florence never had: time and space to be himself in all his multifaceted, maddening, brilliant complexity. In 1483, barely a year after his arrival in Milan, Leonardo received a commission that would occupy him intermittently for more than 2 decades and result in 2 versions of the same painting, a legal dispute that dragged through courts, and a masterpiece that demonstrated his revolutionary approach to light, shadow, and atmospheric effect. The confraternity of the Immaculate Conception contracted with Leonardo and the de Predis brothers to create an altarpiece for their chapel in the church of San Francesco Grande. The contract was specific about what they wanted, down to details of subject matter, size, materials, and deadline. It would be finished, they specified, by December 8, 1483, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. The painting Leonardo conceived bore little relationship to conventional depictions of its subject. He chose to represent not the Immaculate Conception itself, a theological concept difficult to render visually, but instead a meeting between the infant Christ and the infant John the Baptist during the Holy Family's flight into Egypt, an encounter not described in scripture but elaborated in devotional literature. He set the scene not in a domestic interior or an architectural space, but in a mysterious grotto, a cave where rock formations created a natural cathedral, where light filtered through openings in stone, where water dripped and pooled, where stalactites hung like frozen time. The composition was revolutionary in its asymmetry and psychological complexity. Mary sits at the center, but not in rigid symmetry. Her right hand rests protectively on the infant John, who kneels in prayer. Her left hand hovers above the infant Christ, who sits on the ground, blessing John. An angel, often identified as Uriel, kneels behind Christ, supporting him and pointing toward John in a gesture that directs the viewer's attention and explains the relationships between the figures. But it is the setting, more than the figures themselves, that announces Leonardo's transformation of religious painting into something new. The grotto is rendered with geological precision. Leonardo had studied rock formations, understood how water carved stone over eons, how crystals formed, how light behaved in caves. The rocks in the painting are not symbolic backgrounds but actual places that could exist, painted with such attention to natural process that they seem like studies from life rather than invented scenery. Plants grow from crevices in the stone, botanically accurate species that might actually thrive in such an environment. The light is not the even, bright illumination of conventional painting, but the dim, filtered, uncertain light of a cave, light that creates deep shadows and makes faces emerge from darkness. This manipulation of light and shadow, what Leonardo called chiaroscuro, was not merely a technical innovation but a philosophical statement about the nature of reality. Things in the real world do not have hard outlines, do not possess the crisp edges that painters traditionally gave them. Objects exist in atmosphere, surrounded by air that scatters light, creating gradual transitions from light to shadow. Leonardo developed a technique he called sfumato, from the Italian fumo meaning smoke, a method of building up translucent layers of paint so thin that brushstrokes disappeared, creating forms that seemed to emerge from shadow without harsh boundaries, that possessed the soft ambiguity of actual perception. The faces in the Virgin of the Rocks demonstrate sfumato's power. Mary's features are gentle, but not idealized into decorative prettiness. She looks like an actual woman, young but mature, beautiful but human. The angel's face possesses an androgynous quality, beautiful in a way that transcends gender. The infants are painted with attention to how baby flesh actually looks, how light models soft, undefined features. These are not the rigid, adult-faced babies of medieval painting, but actual children, rendered with a tenderness that suggests Leonardo's careful observation of infant anatomy and behavior. But the contract stipulated December 1483, and December 1483 came and went with the painting incomplete. Years passed. The confraternity grew impatient. Legal proceedings began. Leonardo and the de Predis brothers claimed they had completed the central panel, but deserved additional payment for the quality of work, which exceeded what they had been contracted to produce. The confraternity countered that the work was not finished according to specification. The dispute dragged through courts for years, complicated by Leonardo's absences from Milan, by his work on other projects, by his constitutive inability to simply deliver what had been contracted. Eventually, a first version of the painting was completed and, it seems, sold to someone else, possibly Louis XIV of France, who acquired it during his invasion of Milan. Leonardo was then required to paint a second version for the confraternity, which he did not complete until around 1508, a quarter century after the original commission. The two versions differ in subtle ways. The angel in the later version no longer points. The positions of figures are slightly altered. The overall tone is lighter, but both demonstrate Leonardo's revolutionary approach to religious painting. He had transformed the genre from icon into drama, from flat symbolic arrangement into psychologically complex scene. The figures exist in actual space, breathe actual air, relate to each other through glance and gesture rather than hierarchical positioning. The setting is not heaven or symbolic garden, but an actual geological formation, rendered with scientific precision. The light is the light of the real world, filtering through stone, creating shadows that hide as much as they reveal. In this single painting, Leonardo announced that religious art could be simultaneously devotional and naturalistic. That understanding how the world actually looked did not diminish but enhanced the the spiritual power of images. The Virgin of the Rocks was not just a painting, but a manifesto, a demonstration that art and science were not antagonists, but allies in the pursuit of truth. In 1482, the same year Leonardo arrived in Milan bearing his letter of promises, Ludovico Sforza conceived an ambition that would occupy the next decade and more: the creation of the largest bronze horse sculpture ever cast, a monument to his father, Francesco Sforza, founder of the dynasty Condottiero, who had seized Milan through military prowess and political cunning. The monument would proclaim Sforza's legitimacy, would demonstrate that Milan could produce wonders equal to anything ancient Rome had achieved, would give Ludovico a claim to immortality through artistic patronage. It would be, if completed, a masterpiece for the ages. It would never be completed. Leonardo seized on the project with his characteristic combination of enthusiasm and perfectionism. A bronze horse 24 feet tall, possibly bearing a mounted rider, would require solving unprecedented technical problems. No one had successfully cast a bronze sculpture of such size in modern times. The ancient Romans had done it. The Marcus Aurelius equestrian statue in Rome proved it possible, but their techniques had been lost. Leonardo would have to reinvent the technology, understand the metallurgy, calculate the forces, design the casting process from first principles. He began with anatomy. For months, he haunted Milan's stables, observing horses with the same intensity he brought to human anatomy. He measured proportions, studied musculature, drew horses from every angle in every position. He examined how weight distributed through their legs when standing, how muscles tensed and relaxed during movement, how their necks curved, how their manes fell. His notebooks filled with equine studies, hundreds of drawings that revealed not just artistic observation, but scientific analysis. He was not content to know what horses looked like. He needed to understand how they were constructed, why they moved the way they did, what mechanical principles governed their form. The scale of the project was staggering. The horse alone would weigh more than 70 tons in bronze, requiring proportional amounts of metal to be heated to molten state and poured into molds simultaneously. If the bronze cooled unevenly or if air pockets formed during casting, the entire sculpture could crack or collapse. Leonardo studied ancient texts on metallurgy, consulted with foundry workers, designed elaborate systems of furnaces and channels through which molten metal would flow. He created full-scale clay models, first of sections, then of the entire horse, so workers could construct molds around them. By 1493, a full-scale clay model stood in the courtyard of the Castello Sforzesco, towering over spectators who came to marvel at its massive presence. The clay horse alone was a wonder, revealing Leonardo's mastery of form and proportion. Contemporary accounts describe crowds gathering to admire it, poets composing verses about its magnificence, the widespread assumption that Milan would soon possess a marvel unmatched in the modern world. The horse reared up on its hind legs in some early designs, a pose that would have been nearly impossible to cast and support structurally. Eventually, Leonardo settled on a more conventional standing position, with one foreleg raised, which still presented enormous technical challenges but at least fell within the realm of the theoretically possible. The bronze never came. In 1494, the political situation in Italy deteriorated catastrophically. Charles V of France invaded, claiming ancestral rights to the Kingdom of Naples, marching through northern Italy with an army equipped with modern artillery. Ludovico, who had initially encouraged the French invasion as a way to pressure his enemies, suddenly found himself threatened by forces he had helped unleash. Milan needed weapons. The 75 tons of bronze that had been accumulated for Leonardo's horse were recast as cannon, tools of war rather than monuments to art. Leonardo watched as his years of work were literally melted down, transformed from beauty into weaponry, from celebration of life into instruments of death. The clay model remained standing in the courtyard, but without bronze to cast it, it was merely a promise unfulfilled, a declaration of ambition without means of realization. He continued to work intermittently on designs for the monument, perhaps hoping circumstances would change, perhaps simply unable to abandon a project that had consumed so much of his intellectual and creative energy. In 1499, Milan fell to French forces. Louis XIII, claiming the duchy through his grandmother Valentina Visconti, invaded with overwhelming force. Ludovico fled. French troops occupied the city. The clay model of Leonardo's horse stood in the courtyard, where French and Gascon crossbowmen took target practice, using it for sport, destroying in hours what had taken years to create. By the time the occupation ended, the Gran Cavallo was rubble, fragments of clay scattered across stone pavement, the greatest sculpture of the Renaissance existing only in drawings and memory. The failure was complete. No bronze was cast. The model was destroyed. Ludovico's dynasty collapsed. Leonardo's promise to create a monument that would endow with immortal glory and eternal honor the Sforza family lay in ruins, along with French and Italian bodies scattered across Lombardy. It was perhaps his greatest failure, the most public demonstration of the gap between his ambitions and the realities that constrained them. Yet, in another sense, the horse succeeded perfectly. It became legendary precisely because it was never completed, remembered not as a finished monument that tourists would photograph without understanding, but as a dream that history destroyed, an aspiration so large that the world could not accommodate it. The horse that never was became more famous than most sculptures that actually exist, proof that sometimes failure can be more eloquent than success. In 1495, Ludovico Sforza commissioned Leonardo to paint a mural in the refectory of the Dominican convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, a building the Duke was transforming into a Sforza family mausoleum. The subject was conventional, painted in refectories throughout Christian Europe for centuries. The Last Supper, that final meal Christ shared with his disciples before his arrest and crucifixion. The location was equally conventional, painted on the north wall of the dining hall where monks ate their communal meals, the image serving as perpetual reminder of the meal's sacred prototype. What Leonardo created was anything but conventional. It became, despite technical failures that began destroying it almost immediately, one of the most influential paintings in Western art, an image so powerful that it has shaped how Christians visualize that pivotal moment for 5 centuries. Traditional depictions of the Last Supper arrange the 13 figures in a static row. Christ at center, disciples distributed symmetrically, the scene frozen in formal arrangement. Judas, the betrayer, was typically isolated on the opposite side of the table from the others, marked by his separation, sometimes painted darker or given demonic features. Leonardo rejected this entire tradition. He chose to depict the moment immediately after Christ announces, "One of you will betray me," capturing not a posed tableau but an explosive instant of emotional reaction, each disciple responding according to his temperament. The 12 figures erupting into gesture and speech, their hands spread in denial or clenched in anger, their bodies turning toward Christ or toward each other, seeking explanation or offering protestation. The composition was brilliant in its psychological sophistication. Leonardo grouped the disciples in 4 clusters of 3, creating rhythmic variation while maintaining unity. Each figure's gesture and expression was distinct, individualized, suggesting interior consciousness rather than generic representation. Peter leans aggressively toward Christ, a knife gripped in his right hand, foreshadowing his later violence in the garden. John, traditionally shown leaning on Christ's breast, instead slumps away from him, overcome with sorrow or shock. Judas sits not apart but among the others, his face in shadow, his hand reaching toward the same dish as Christ, fulfilling the prophecy while remaining initially unidentifiable, the betrayer hidden among the faithful, evil wearing the face of ordinary humanity. The perspective was calculated with mathematical precision. Leonardo constructed the composition so that all orthogonal lines converged at Christ's head, making him the literal vanishing point toward which all space recedes. The architectural setting, a simple room with coffered ceiling and 3 windows opening to landscape beyond, extends the actual space of the refectory, creating the illusion that the painted chamber is continuous with the room where monks eat. Ludovico, in an unfortunate burst of practical thinking, had ordered a doorway cut through the wall after Leonardo had begun painting, destroying Christ's feet and the lower portion of the composition. But the overall effect of unified space remained powerful despite this vandalism. But it was in the technical execution that Leonardo made his fatal error. Traditional fresco technique required painting on wet plaster, working quickly before it dried, colors becoming permanent as the plaster cured. The method was proven, durable, but inflexible. It allowed no second thoughts, no slow refinement, no extended contemplation. Leonardo, who never worked quickly, who revised constantly, who needed time to consider each detail, rejected fresco in favor of his own experimental technique. He sealed the wall with a preparation layer, then painted with tempera and oil, working slowly over months and years, able to add tiny details and subtle gradations that fresco could never accommodate. The method produced unprecedented beauty and began failing almost immediately. Moisture from the wall penetrated Leonardo's preparation layer, causing paint to flake and blur. Within 20 years, contemporaries noted that the painting was deteriorating. Within 50 years, it was in serious decay. Subsequent centuries brought further damage. Well-meaning restorers who repainted large sections. A doorway hacked through the center. Napoleon's troops who used the refectory as a stable. Bombs during World War II that destroyed most of the surrounding buildings while leaving the refectory miraculously standing, though badly damaged. By the late 20th century, what remained of Leonardo's actual paint was fragmentary, overlaid with centuries of restoration and decay. Yet even in its ruined state, the power of the conception comes through. The psychological drama, the geometric perfection, the moment of crisis captured with such intensity that it seems to extend beyond the wall into the viewer's space. All of this survives despite technical failure and physical damage. Leonardo had attempted something unprecedented, to make a wall painting that possessed all the subtlety and refinement he could achieve on wooden panel, to unite architectural decoration with the psychological complexity of portraiture, to capture not a static icon but a moment of human drama so intense that 500 years have not exhausted its emotional charge. He worked on the painting intermittently for 3 years, sometimes standing before it for hours without adding a single brushstroke, simply staring, contemplating, thinking. The prior of the convent complained to Ludovico that Leonardo was lazy, that he disappeared for days, that the work progressed impossibly slowly. Leonardo responded reportedly that men of genius sometimes accomplish most when they appear to be working least, that without time for contemplation, art becomes mere craft. He also noted that he was having difficulty finding an appropriate face for Judas, but that if the prior continued to complain, he would be happy to use the prior's features as his model. Ludovico, according to Vasari, laughed at this threat and told the prior to leave Leonardo alone. The Last Supper represents both Leonardo's greatest triumph and clearest failure. As a conception, as a demonstration of how painting could capture psychological complexity and dramatic intensity, it was revolutionary. As a physical object, as a durable work of art that would survive intact for future generations, it failed catastrophically. The gap between vision and execution, between ambition and practical reality, was never more evident. Yet paradoxically, the painting's fragility, its gradual disappearance, has perhaps made it more precious, more moving. We see it knowing it is vanishing, that each year takes more of Leonardo's actual brushwork, that we are looking at something that exists partially in memory and imagination rather than entirely in pigment. The Last Supper reminds us that beauty is temporal, that even the greatest human achievements decay, that loss is written into all creation. In 1499, Milan fell. The French king Louis XIII, claiming inheritance rights through his grandmother, invaded Lombardy with overwhelming force. Ludovico Sforza, who had ruled as duke for 2 decades, fled in disguise. His brief attempt to retake the city the following year ended in capture and imprisonment. He would die in a French dungeon 8 years later, never again seeing the Milan he had beautified and defended. Leonardo, having served the Sforza court for nearly 18 years, suddenly found himself without patron, without position, without the security he had known since 1482. He was 47 years old, famous for unfinished projects and technical brilliance, respected as a genius and mistrusted as unreliable. He needed work, and Florence, now a republic again after the brief theocratic dictatorship of Savonarola, represented his best option. But Florence was not the city he had left. The Medici had been expelled. The Republican government, fragile and contested, struggled to maintain independence against external threats and internal factions. The city had been traumatized by Savonarola's puritanical regime, his bonfires of vanities where artworks and books were burned as corrupting luxuries, his apocalyptic preaching that divided Florence into armed camps before he was himself burned as a heretic in 1498. The cultural atmosphere remained tense. Uncertain, the confident humanism of Lorenzo de' Medici's era replaced by a more anxious, militarized civic identity. Leonardo returned as a celebrity, his reputation preceding him. The Last Supper, despite its technical failures, was already legendary. Stories circulated about his genius, his experiments, his unfinished works. The Republican government, eager to demonstrate Florence's renewed commitment to artistic excellence, commissioned him to paint a massive battle scene on the wall of the Palazzo Vecchio's Great Council Hall. The subject? The Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine victory over Milanese forces in 1440, a triumph that held particular resonance now that Florence again faced military threats to its independence. The commission carried extra weight because the government simultaneously hired Michelangelo Buonarroti, 30 years younger than Leonardo, to paint the opposite wall with a scene from the Battle of Caterina. Here were Florence's 2 greatest artists, though artists hardly captured what they were, set in direct competition, their works facing each other in the Republic's most important civic space. The rivalry between them was real and bitter. Michelangelo, whose Pietà in Rome and David in Florence had established him as Christendom's greatest sculptor, had a temperament utterly unlike Leonardo's. Where Leonardo was elegant, cultivated, well-dressed, Michelangelo was crude, obsessive, often filthy from marble dust, contemptuous of refinement. Where Leonardo's mind ranged across all subjects, Michelangelo focused with laser intensity on human form as religious expression. The 2 men apparently detested each other. Michelangelo criticized Leonardo's failure to complete the bronze horse, implying that promises without delivery were worthless. Leonardo dismissed Michelangelo as a mere sculptor, inferior to painting, which required understanding of color, atmosphere, and light rather than simply carving stone. The rivalry was both personal and philosophical, representing different conceptions of art's purpose and possibilities. Their simultaneous presence in Florence created an electric atmosphere of competition and comparison that drew artists from across Italy to observe and learn. Leonardo designed his Battle of Anghiari as a study in violence and chaos, a savage tangle of men and horses fighting for a standard, faces contorted with rage and effort, horses biting each other, weapons raised, bodies straining. His preparatory drawings showed unprecedented understanding of how combat actually looked, how horses moved in battle, how human faces registered extreme emotion. He was attempting something never achieved, a realistic depiction of warfare's horror and intensity, not a decorative celebration of victory, but a terrifying representation of lethal struggle. As with the Last Supper, Leonardo rejected conventional fresco technique. He experimented with encaustic painting, heating the wall to make pigments bond, a method described in ancient texts but not successfully practiced in modern times. The experiment failed. Paint ran, colors blurred, large sections refused to dry properly. After months of struggle with technique, Leonardo abandoned the project, leaving only fragments and preparatory drawings. The Republic of Florence, which had invested enormous sums in both commissions, found itself with two unfinished walls where two masterpieces should have hung. Michelangelo's project fared no better. He completed the cartoon, the full-scale preparatory drawing, which became legendary for its depiction of nude soldiers surprised while bathing, their muscular forms displayed in poses of urgent movement. But before he could transfer the cartoon to the wall, Pope Julius II summoned him to Rome to work on the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. The cartoon was eventually destroyed, cut into pieces by artists who wanted fragments of the master's work. Both commissions ended in failure, though both produced preparatory works that influenced generations of artists. These Florentine years revealed something harsh about Leonardo's position. His genius was undeniable, but his utility questionable. Patrons wanted finished works, and Leonardo seemed constitutionally incapable of providing them. His investigations and experiments, his insistence on understanding everything completely before proceeding, his perfectionism that made completion feel like abandonment, all of this made him a risky investment. He was famous but not reliable, admired but not trusted with important commissions that required timely delivery. Yet during these same years, he was beginning work on the painting that would become his most famous, the portrait that would eventually overshadow everything else he created. A Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo commissioned Leonardo to paint his wife, Lisa Gherardini. It was a conventional commission for a conventional purpose, a marriage portrait celebrating a young wife and new mother. What Leonardo would create from this prosaic beginning would become anything but conventional. But in 1503, that transformation still lay in the future, unrevealed even to Leonardo himself. She sits before us, this woman whose actual identity matters less than what she has become, with her hands folded, her gaze direct but ambiguous, her expression suggesting knowledge she will not share. Behind her stretches an impossible landscape, paths that lead nowhere, bridges that span imaginary rivers, mountains that dissolve into atmospheric distance, a world that exists only in paint and imagination. The portrait is small, barely 30 inches tall, painted on 3 pieces of poplar wood joined together, its physical presence modest, unremarkable until one actually looks at it, until one sees what Leonardo has done. Lisa Gherardini was 24 when Francesco del Giocondo commissioned her portrait, probably in 1503 to commemorate the birth of their second son and the purchase of a new house. She came from a respectable but not particularly distinguished Florentine family, had married at 16, bore children, lived the life expected of merchant-class wives in Republican Florence. Nothing in her biography suggests she was anything other than ordinary, though ordinary is relative in a city that produced Dante, Donatello, Brunelleschi, and Botticelli. Leonardo accepted the commission, perhaps needing money, perhaps intrigued by some quality he saw in her face, perhaps simply accepting the work available to him. He began painting her, and something happened. The portrait became not a job to complete, but a problem to solve, an investigation into what portraiture could accomplish, what a painted face could convey beyond simple likeness. He worked on it obsessively, carrying it with him as he moved from Florence to Milan to Rome to France, adding tiny touches, refining details, adjusting the subtle gradations of tone that created the illusion of three-dimensional form. He never delivered it to Francesco del Giocondo, never considered it finished, never stopped working on it until perhaps his final years when illness made painting impossible. The technique was sfumato carried to unprecedented extremes. There are no lines in the Mona Lisa, no edges where one form definitively ends and another begins. Everything emerges from shadow through infinite gradations of tone, the way things actually appear in the world when we look at them without the simplifying abstraction that normal perception imposes. The face is constructed from layers of translucent paint so thin that perhaps 40 or more were applied to create the final effect. Each layer, invisible individually, but contributing to the cumulative impression of skin that seems to have depth and translucency, that appears to exist in actual atmosphere rather than painted on flat wood. The eyes meet the viewer's gaze with unsettling directness. They seem to follow as one moves, a trick of perspective and modeling that makes the portrait feel interactive, responsive, alive in ways that painted faces rarely achieve. But it is the mouth that has fascinated viewers for 5 centuries, that slight asymmetry, that suggestion of a smile that seems simultaneously present and absent, that changes depending on how one looks at it, where one stands, what mood one brings to the viewing. Leonardo understood something profound about human expression, that it is fleeting, ambiguous, never fixed in single configurations but constantly shifting across faces like clouds across sky. The landscape behind her is equally mysterious. No actual place looks like this, the mountains too steep, the atmosphere too dense, the perspective slightly distorted, the two sides of the painting at different elevations as if the world itself were tilted. It is a painted invention, a landscape of the mind rather than any actual geography, suggesting perhaps that the woman exists simultaneously in physical reality and psychological space, that what we see is not just Lisa Gherardini, but some eternal feminine principle, some archetype of womanhood itself. Leonardo kept the painting, carried it with him, showed it to visitors who invariably responded with amazement. Giorgio Vasari, writing decades later, described how Leonardo had employed musicians and jesters while Lisa posed to keep her from developing the melancholy expression that often afflicted portrait subjects during long sittings. Whether this story is true or invented, it suggests the painting's power to provoke narrative, to make viewers imagine the circumstances of its creation, to demand explanation for its strange perfection. The painting's fame came later. During Leonardo's lifetime and for centuries after, it was known to connoisseurs but not particularly famous. It hung in Francis Nordin's collection at Fontainebleau, passed into royal possession, eventually entered the Louvre's collection. In the 19th century, Romantic writers discovered it, projecting onto that ambiguous face their fantasies of feminine mystery, eternal beauty, forbidden knowledge. Walter Pater wrote of her that she was older than the rocks among which she sits, that she had been a diver in deep seas, that she embodied all of history's fascinating and dangerous women. The theft of the painting in 1911 by an Italian nationalist who wanted to return it to Italy made it internationally famous. The 2 years it was missing generated more publicity than centuries of hanging quietly in museums. Today it is perhaps the most famous painting in existence, viewed by millions annually, reproduced endlessly, parodied and commercialized, made into everything from coffee mugs to t-shirts. So familiar that actually seeing the original is almost impossible. We see instead the accumulated weight of reproduction and commentary, the cultural freight it has accumulated. The painting itself, small and dark behind protective glass in the Louvre, surrounded by crowds and barriers, seems almost anticlimactic. One must work to see past its fame to glimpse what Leonardo actually painted: a woman, not particularly beautiful by conventional standards, painted with such technical mastery and psychological insight that she seems to possess consciousness, to exist simultaneously as paint on wood and as living presence. Leonardo never considered it finished, but perhaps he was right. The Mona Lisa is not a finished statement, but an ongoing question, not a solution, but a problem posed for all who look at it. What are we seeing? Who is she? Why does this face, these eyes, this slight smile continue to haunt us? Leonardo created not just a portrait, but a mirror, a surface onto which each age projects its own concerns and desires, finding in that ambiguous expression whatever it most needs or fears to see. The smell must have been overwhelming: decaying flesh, exposed organs, bodily fluids leaking onto tables. But Leonardo, approaching 50 years old, bent over corpses with the concentration of a jeweler examining precious stones. By candlelight in hospital rooms and monasteries, using whatever spaces would permit such transgressive work, he systematically dismantled human bodies, separating muscle from bone, tracing nerves through tissue, following blood vessels to their terminations, examining organs in various states of disease and health. He was conducting investigations that would not be surpassed for centuries, creating anatomical illustrations of such precision that they remained useful to medical students into the 20th century. His interest in human anatomy had begun decades earlier with artistic concerns: how to paint bodies convincingly, how to represent weight and movement, how muscles created surface form. But somewhere during his investigations, the artist's practical concerns transformed into something larger, a systematic attempt to understand how the human machine functioned, how this assembly of flesh and bone and fluid managed to produce consciousness, movement, sensation, life itself. He was no longer studying anatomy to paint better, but studying it to understand what a human being actually was, beneath the skin that hid the body's mysteries. He acquired corpses through hospital contacts, through arrangements with monasteries and municipal authorities. The sources were usually the poor, the unclaimed, criminals executed for their offenses. Renaissance society was squeamish about anatomical study, but pragmatic. If dead bodies could advance medical knowledge, better they serve that purpose than simply decay unmourned. Leonardo worked quickly once he obtained a corpse, racing against decomposition, trying to complete his observations and drawings before rot made further study impossible. He recorded that he personally dissected more than 30 bodies, though not all of his anatomical studies came from direct observation. Some were copied from medical texts. Others were theoretical extrapolations. His methods were systematic and revolutionary. Previous anatomical illustrations were crude, schematic, more concerned with identifying organs than understanding their structure or function. Leonardo approached each body as a problem in engineering, trying to understand not just what was present, but how it worked. He injected wax into ventricles of the brain to create casts that revealed their shape. He cut away muscles in layers to understand their arrangement. He opened pregnant women to study the fetus in the womb, creating illustrations that showed the curled infant position with unprecedented accuracy, the umbilical cord connecting mother and child, the layered membranes that protected developing life. His drawings are masterpieces of both art and science. A series of images showing the arm in progressive dissection reveals first the skin, then muscles, then deeper muscles, then bones, each rendered with such precision that physicians could use them to understand actual anatomy. His illustrations of the heart showed valve structures that would not be fully understood for another century. He recognized, though incompletely, that blood circulated rather than being consumed, and regenerated as ancient authorities had claimed. He studied the eye's anatomy, understanding something of how the lens focused light onto the retina, connecting his optical investigations to the physical structures that made vision possible. The skull fascinated him particularly. He drew it from multiple angles, showing how bone plates joined, where nerves entered and exited, how the brain's housing was constructed. In one famous illustration, he sectioned the skull horizontally, revealing the sinuses and cranial cavity, marking with precise measurements the relationships between different parts. He was seeking the seat of consciousness, the sensus communis, where he believed sensory information converged to create unified perception. He did not find it. How could he, when consciousness emerges from neural processes invisible to Renaissance anatomy? But the search itself was profound, the attempt to locate the self within the body, to understand how matter produced mind. His notebooks from this period contain passages of clinical description alongside expressions of something like existential horror. "The body of a man dissected," he wrote, "is so beautiful in its construction that it fills one with awe." But elsewhere he noted the difficulty of the work. "Though you have a love for such things, you will perhaps be impeded by your stomach, and if this does not impede you, you will perhaps be impeded by the fear of living through the night hours in the company of these corpses. Quartered and flayed and frightful to behold, he persisted despite revulsion and fear, driven by curiosity stronger than discomfort. What he discovered challenged, received wisdom. Galen, the ancient physician whose texts remained authoritative in Renaissance medicine, had based his human anatomy largely on animal dissection, particularly pigs and apes. Leonardo, working from actual human cadavers, found discrepancies. The heart had 4 chambers, not 3 as Galen claimed. The liver's structure differed from descriptions in medical texts. The uterus was nothing like illustrations in standard references, which often showed it with multiple chambers like animal uteruses. Yet he made errors too. He showed the optic nerve correctly but connected it to a wrong part of the brain. Some of his circulatory system diagrams were more theoretical than observational. He was working without microscopes, without an understanding of cells, without knowledge of bacteria or immune systems, or countless other discoveries that later science would provide. His anatomy was revolutionary but incomplete, brilliant within the limits of what Renaissance investigation could achieve, but necessarily bounded by those limits. What remains most astonishing is not the errors, but the scope and precision of what he got right. Working with primitive tools in difficult conditions, having to invent methods and techniques because no established protocols existed, he transformed anatomical illustration from crude schematic to precise scientific documentation. He understood that the body was a machine, a wondrous machine whose operations followed physical principles, whose structures served functions, whose design could be studied and comprehended. In doing so, he helped lay foundations for modern medicine, for the scientific study of the body that would eventually lead to surgery, pharmacology, and all the medical advances that followed. But perhaps more important than specific discoveries was his approach, the insistence on direct observation rather than textual authority, the combination of artist's eye and engineer's analytical mind, the refusal to accept that anything was beyond investigation. He looked inside human bodies to understand what humans were, and in that looking, in that willingness to confront mortality and decay in service of knowledge, he demonstrated what it meant to be fully alive, curious, fearless, committed to understanding reality as it actually existed rather than as tradition claimed it must be. In the summer of 1502, Leonardo entered into one of the strangest and morally most compromising arrangements of his career. He became military engineer to Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois, son of Pope Alexander VI, a man whose name had become synonymous with ruthless ambition, strategic brutality, and the naked exercise of power unconstrained by conventional morality. Cesare was attempting to carve out a permanent state in the Romagna region of central Italy, conquering city-states through a combination of military force, political manipulation, and calculated terror. He needed engineers who could design fortifications, plan sieges, improve his army's tactical capabilities. Leonardo, 50 years old and perpetually short of money, accepted the position. The decision must have required some internal accommodation, some reconciliation between the pacifist vegetarian who refused to eat meat because he opposed causing suffering to living creatures, and the practical necessity of serving a warlord whose methods included assassination, betrayal, and mass execution. Leonardo's notebooks from this period contain no moral reflections on his employer's character, no hand-wringing about complicity in violence. Instead, they fill with maps, fortress designs, observations about military architecture, technical notes about improving artillery and defensive positions. He traveled through the Romagna in Cesare's train, visiting conquered cities, inspecting fortifications, producing maps of unprecedented accuracy and beauty. His map of Imola, created in 1502, was revolutionary. A precise bird's-eye view of the city, showing streets, buildings, and defensive walls with geometric accuracy, oriented to the compass points, scaled proportionally. No map like it existed in Italy. Most city maps were crude approximations, more symbolic than accurate. Leonardo's map was a tool of military control, allowing Cesare to understand terrain, plan movements, identify strategic points. It was cartography as weapon. He also befriended Niccolo Machiavelli, who was in Cesare's court as an envoy from Florence, observing the Duke's methods, taking notes that would eventually inform the prince, that cold-eyed analysis of power that shocked Europe with its frank acknowledgement that effective rulers often cannot afford conventional morality. The two men, Leonardo and Machiavelli, shared something: a willingness to observe reality without flinching, to understand how things actually worked rather than how they ought to work, to separate analysis from moral judgment. They walked together, talked, watched Cesare operate, each learning lessons that confirmed their existing suspicions about power and human nature. But the arrangement did not last. Cesare's fortunes were precarious, dependent on his father's position as pope and on military success that required constant campaigning. In 1503, Alexander VI died suddenly, possibly poisoned, possibly from natural causes. Without his father's support, Cesare's power collapsed almost immediately. His enemies united against him, his conquered cities rebelled, his army deserted. Within months, the man who had seemed on the verge of creating a new Italian state was a prisoner, stripped of power, eventually dying in obscurity in Spain. Leonardo, who had served him for less than a year, departed without ceremony or regret, returning to Florence to seek more stable employment. The experience left traces in Leonardo's thinking. His notebooks contain designs for terrifying weapons: a steam-powered cannon, a giant crossbow, armored vehicles, even what appears to be an early conception of a machine gun, multiple barrels arranged to fire in sequence. Some historians argue these were merely theoretical exercises, that Leonardo never intended them to be built, that they represented his investigation of mechanical principles rather than actual desire to create instruments of death. Others point out that he offered these designs to multiple patrons, that he explicitly presented himself as someone who could make war more efficient and deadly. Perhaps both interpretations contain truth. Leonardo was capable of compartmentalizing, of pursuing technical problems without fully confronting their moral implications, of serving power while maintaining some interior distance from it. He could design weapons with the same analytical detachment he brought to studying water flow or bird flight, treating warfare as another phenomenon requiring systematic understanding. Yet one also senses in his later years a deepening pessimism about human nature, a recognition that the same intelligence that could create beauty could equally create devastation, that knowledge was morally neutral, equally available for construction or destruction. The wandering years, from Milan's fall in 1499 through his service with Cesare and return to Florence, were years without anchor, without stable patronage, without the sustained support that allowed extended projects. He moved from city to city, accepted commissions he would not complete, served patrons whose fortunes proved temporary. These were not his finest years, not a period of great achievements or breakthrough discoveries, but rather a time of survival, of maintaining reputation while seeking security, of aging without the certainty that his old age would be comfortable or honored. The Renaissance, which had seemed to promise that talent would be rewarded and genius recognized, was revealing itself as precarious, violent, indifferent to anything but immediate utility. Leonardo was learning what most people discover eventually, that the world does not organize itself around one's gifts, that even genius must accommodate itself to circumstances beyond its control. When French forces recaptured Milan in 1506, Leonardo returned to the city that had given him his most productive years, hoping perhaps to recapture something of what he had known under Ludovico Sforza. Charles d'Amboise, the French governor, welcomed him, provided salary and housing, commissioned works. But Milan under French occupation was not the Milan of Ludovico's court. The city had been traumatized by warfare, its population diminished, its cultural life disrupted. The Sforza court's brilliance, those gatherings of mathematicians and poets, those theatrical spectacles, that atmosphere of intellectual ferment, existed only in memory. Leonardo was 54 years old. Still vigorous but no longer young, his reputation established but his productivity questionable. He worked on various projects, designs for a monument to Gian Giacomo Trivulzio, the Italian condottiero who had served the French, studies for improving Milan's canal system, anatomical investigations that continued his earlier dissections, mechanical studies, geological observations. But nothing major emerged, no paintings to rival the Last Supper, no sculptures to replace the lost bronze horse. He was becoming what he had perhaps always been, more interested in investigation than completion, more fascinated by problems than by finished solutions. In 1513, Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo IX, and Leonardo, along with much of artistic Italy, migrated to Rome, drawn by the promise of papal patronage. Rome was experiencing its own renaissance, transforming from the ruined medieval city it had been into a new capital of Christendom. Julius II, the warrior pope who preceded Leo, had commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and had begun rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica. Raphael was painting the Vatican apartments with frescoes that combined classical learning and Christian themes. Rome was becoming a vast construction site, a city being rebuilt according to humanist ideals and papal ambition. But Leonardo found himself overshadowed, marginalized, reduced to minor projects that barely engaged his abilities. Michelangelo was at the height of his powers, finishing the Sistine ceiling to universal acclaim, preparing to begin the tomb of Julius II Raphael. Only 30 years old, was producing masterpiece after masterpiece, his productivity and reliability making him the papal favorite. Against these younger rivals, Leonardo seemed almost irrelevant, famous for past achievements, but unable to deliver new works that matched the energy and confidence of the moment. The Pope's brother, Giuliano de' Medici, employed Leonardo on various minor commissions, studies for draining the Pontine marshes, designs for improved coinage, investigations into mirrors and optics. None of this engaged his deepest capacities. He spent time on strange experiments, investigating the properties of curved mirrors, studying the flight of birds with obsessive attention, dissecting an old man who died in a Roman hospital, searching for the cause of such peaceful death in a body that showed no obvious disease. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind still curious but increasingly disconnected from practical projects, pursuing knowledge for its own sake rather than toward any defined goal. Tensions arose. Another artist in Giuliano's service, a German mirror maker, accused Leonardo of sorcery, of dabbling in forbidden knowledge. The accusation was absurd but dangerous. The church was growing more nervous about intellectual autonomy, more willing to enforce doctrinal conformity. Leonardo had to defend himself, explain his investigations, prove that anatomical study and optical experiments were natural philosophy rather than black magic. The need to justify his curiosity to suspicious authorities must have been galling, a reminder that the confident humanism of his youth was giving way to something more constrained, more anxious. His relationship with Michelangelo remained poisonous. The younger artist made no secret of his contempt for Leonardo's inability to finish projects, his endless investigations that produced drawings but rarely completed works. Michelangelo's productivity, the Sistine ceiling, the massive sculptures, the architectural designs, made Leonardo's notebooks full of unrealized projects seem like evasion rather than investigation. The comparison was painful, the more so because it contained truth. Leonardo was genuinely unable to complete works at the pace patrons required, genuinely more interested in understanding than in producing finished objects for display. Rome offered him one consolation: intellectual companionship. He befriended scholars and scientists, discussed optics and mathematics, corresponded with thinkers across Italy. But friendship could not compensate for the growing sense that his moment had passed, that the Renaissance was moving beyond him, that younger artists with different concerns and methods were defining what mattered. He had helped create the world that now seemed to have no place for him, had taught artists to observe nature carefully and paint with psychological insight. And now those lessons had been absorbed and surpassed by men who lacked his genius but possessed his discipline. In 1516, when Giuliano de' Medici died, Leonardo lost his last Italian patron. He was 64 years old, living in a city where the Pope preferred Raphael and Michelangelo, where major commissions went to younger men, where his reputation as unreliable overshadowed his undeniable brilliance. He needed security, steady income, a place where he would be valued for what he was rather than judged for what he failed to deliver. That place improbably turned out to be France, where a young king named Francis III had long admired Italian culture and specifically Leonardo's genius, where a new chapter waited, brief but dignified, a final refuge for the wandering mind. Late in his life, perhaps during the Roman years or possibly earlier, Leonardo began creating a series of drawings unlike anything else in his vast output. They depicted deluges, catastrophic floods where water descends from the heavens and rises from the earth simultaneously, destroying everything in their path. Mountains crumble, buildings collapse, trees are torn from the ground and hurled through turbulent air. Human figures, tiny and helpless, are swept away by forces utterly indifferent to their suffering. These were not illustrations for any commission, not studies for paintings, not practical investigations of hydraulic engineering. They were visions, expressions of something interior and dark, images of apocalypse drawn with the same precision he brought to anatomical studies or botanical observations. The drawings show water behaving according to physical principles Leonardo had spent decades studying. The spirals and vortices, the way falling water creates particular patterns, the turbulence of floods meeting obstacles, all of this is rendered with scientific accuracy. But the cumulative effect is not scientific detachment but existential horror, a sense that the natural world whose operations Leonardo had so patiently investigated was ultimately hostile to human existence, that the same forces that created beauty and life could equally create devastation and death. In some drawings, water descends from clouds in columns like solid pillars, crashing into Earth with sufficient force to create craters and send debris flying. In others, floods rise from valleys carrying trees and boulders and fragments of buildings in their churning mass, reducing human civilization to flotsam in currents that follow mathematical principles but respect no human meaning. The sky darkens with storm clouds that seem almost alive, organic forms that twist and roil, suggesting not just weather but cosmic violence. Nature as antagonist rather than the ordered system Renaissance thinkers wanted to believe in. He accompanied these drawings with text describing even more terrible destructions. Let the dark and gloomy air be seen beaten by the rush of opposing winds, dense with the perpetual rain mingled with hail, and bearing hither and thither a vast network of the torn branches of trees mixed together with an infinite number of leaves. The prose is almost biblical in its apocalyptic intensity, describing a world coming apart, dissolving into chaos, returning to the formless void that preceded creation. What prompted these visions? Perhaps the violence Leonardo had witnessed during Italy's perpetual wars, the cities sacked, the populations massacred, the casual cruelty that humans inflicted on each other. Perhaps his anatomical studies, which had shown him how fragile the human body was, how easily flesh could be destroyed, how thin the boundary was between life and death. Perhaps simply old age, the recognition of his own mortality, the understanding that all his knowledge and achievement would end, that death waited for genius and fool alike, that the universe would continue its operations completely indifferent to any individual existence. Or perhaps the deluge drawings represented something more philosophical, a recognition that the Renaissance project itself, the belief that human reason could comprehend and master nature, that observation and experimentation could reveal laws that would give humans control over their environment, was ultimately illusory. Leonardo had devoted his life to understanding natural processes, to investigating how things worked, to accumulating knowledge. But knowledge did not grant control. Understanding water's behavior did not prevent floods. Comprehending anatomy did not defeat death. The more he learned, the more he recognized how much remained unknown, how limited human capability was, how brief individual existence was against the vast timescales of geological and cosmic process. The drawings can be seen as the endpoint of Leonardo's investigations, the final conclusion drawn from decades of observation. Nature was not a book to be read, a system to be mastered, a machine whose operations could be comprehended and controlled. Nature was power, inhuman and indifferent, operating according to principles that might be studied but could not be changed, creating and destroying without intention or meaning. Human beings, with their cities and paintings and books and all their accumulated culture, were temporary arrangements of matter, destined to return to formlessness, forgotten by a universe that never noticed their existence. Yet even in depicting this apocalyptic vision, Leonardo could not abandon his scientific precision. The water in the deluge drawings behaves correctly, the physics are accurate, the spirals and vortices follow laws he had discovered through patient observation. Even in imagining the end of everything, he remained faithful to how things actually worked. This was perhaps the deepest expression of his genius, the inability to falsify observation even in service of imagination, the commitment to truth even when truth was terrifying. The deluge drawings were not widely known during his lifetime or for centuries after. They remained in his notebooks, private meditations rather than public statements, images he created for himself rather than for patrons or posterity. Only much later, when scholars began systematically studying his manuscripts, did these visions of apocalypse emerge into wider awareness. They complicate our understanding of Leonardo, challenging the image of the confident Renaissance humanist. revealing a darker consciousness aware of destruction and endings, a mind that looked at the world and saw not just beauty and order but also violence and meaninglessness. In the autumn of 1516, Leonardo crossed the Alps one final time, travelling north toward France at the invitation of Francis I, the young king who had conquered Milan the previous year and who revered Italian culture with the enthusiasm of a convert. Leonardo was 64 years old, his right hand partially paralyzed by a stroke, his painting days essentially finished, his body beginning the slow surrender that age demands of even the most vital spirits. He brought with him almost nothing: some clothes, a few instruments, his notebooks containing a lifetime of observations, and 3 paintings he had never delivered to their commissioners: the Mona Lisa, a painting of John the Baptist, and one of the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. These were his treasures, the works he had carried for years, refining endlessly, unable to declare them complete. Francis installed him in a small manor house at Clou, near the royal chateau at Amboise, in the Loire Valley, where French kings maintained their favorite residences. The arrangement was generous, almost miraculous for an aging artist whose productivity had always been questionable. Leonardo received a substantial pension, no specific duties, the title of premier painter, engineer, and architect to the king, and, most precious of all, respect. Francis visited him regularly, called him "my father," listened to his stories and observations, treated him not as an employee but as a treasure, a living repository of Renaissance genius. These final years were tranquil in ways Leonardo's life had rarely been. He could not paint, his paralyzed hand made detailed work impossible, but his mind remained active, curious, engaged. He designed a mechanical lion for court entertainments, a marvel that could walk forward and then open its chest to reveal lilies, symbol of French royalty. He advised on architectural projects, proposed improvements to the chateau at Amboise, sketched plans for ideal cities and canal systems that would never be built. He received visitors, showed them his paintings and drawings, discussed his investigations, lived as a philosopher sage rather than a working artist. On May 2, 1519, Leonardo died in his bed at Clou. Legend claims he died in King Francis's arms. Though historians doubt this, the king was likely elsewhere when Leonardo's final illness reached its conclusion. But the legend persists because it captures an emotional truth: that Leonardo ended his days honored, valued, surrounded by respect, rather than the frustration and disappointment that had marked so much of his career. He was buried in the chapel of Saint-Florentin at Amboise, though the chapel was destroyed during the French Revolution, and his bones, lost, scattered, returned to the earth he had studied so carefully. What he left behind was not a collection of completed masterpieces. There were perhaps 15 paintings that could be definitely attributed to him, several of those unfinished, but something stranger and more valuable: thousands of notebook pages filled with drawings, observations, questions, investigations. After his death, these papers scattered across Europe, sold by his assistant Francesco Melzi's heirs, broken up, lost, rediscovered, collected by monarchs and scholars. What survived, perhaps 1/4 of what he actually produced, revealed a mind that had ranged across nearly every domain of human knowledge: anatomy, botany, geology, optics, mechanics, hydraulics, architecture, military engineering, mathematics. The influence was slow building but ultimately overwhelming. In his own time, Leonardo was famous but not understood, admired but also dismissed as unreliable. The 19th century discovered him properly, recognizing in his notebooks a scientific method that anticipated modern approaches, an empiricism that privileged observation over authority, a willingness to investigate everything without regard for conventional boundaries between disciplines. He became the symbol of the Renaissance man, the universal genius whose existence proved that human potential could exceed any single category. But perhaps Leonardo's deepest legacy is not any specific discovery or technique, but rather his example, the demonstration that curiosity itself is a form of devotion, that paying attention to the world with full presence is its own reward, that understanding can be pursued for its own sake rather than for utility or profit. He showed that a human life could be organized around questions rather than answers, that the perpetual beginner's mind, always willing to reconsider, always eager to investigate further, could produce insights that confident expertise would miss. 5 centuries after his death, we still study his notebooks, still marvel at his drawings, still find new meanings in the Mona Lisa's enigmatic expression. We see in him something we aspire to be, fully alive to the world's complexity, intellectually courageous, committed to truth regardless of where investigation leads. He was not a saint. He could be vain, difficult, unreliable, morally compromised, but he was authentic, devoted to his vision, even when that vision brought him frustration rather than success. In the quiet shadows of history, where time softens edges and distance reveals patterns invisible to contemporaries, Leonardo da Vinci stands as testament to the power of sustained attention, proof that one human consciousness, sufficiently curious and sufficiently disciplined, can illuminate reality in ways that continue to matter centuries after that consciousness ceases to exist. The greatest mind that ever lived was perhaps simply the most persistently curious, the most unwilling to accept easy answers, the most committed to seeing clearly regardless of cost. And in the end, that commitment to seeing, to understanding, to asking endless questions, that was the gift he left us, more valuable than any finished painting, more enduring than any marble monument. His true legacy lives not in museums, but in every mind that looks at the world and asks, how does this work? Why is it so? What more might I discover if I simply pay attention?